Today, Donald Trump told the world that peace talks with Iran begin. Today. Right now, as I'm recording this. There's just one problem. Iran says that's not true. Not, we're reconsidering. Not, we need more time. Iran's own foreign ministry came out and said, in plain language, there are no plans to send a delegation and no plans to receive one either. So one of two things is happening here. Either the President of the United States is getting ahead of a deal that isn't finished yet, or he's saying something he knows isn't true, for reasons we need to talk about. Stick with me for the next 20 minutes, because I'm going to walk you through exactly what was said, what was denied, and what it actually means for where this war goes next. Welcome back to the Daniel Brief. If you're new here, this is where we cut through the noise coming out of Washington, Tehran, and everywhere in between, and look at what the actual statements, the actual timelines, and the actual facts are telling us, not what either side wants you to believe. If that's the kind of channel you're looking for, hit subscribe, because this Iran story is moving fast, and I'll be covering it as it develops. Now, Matan, let's get into it. Let's back up, because to understand why today's announcement is so strange, you need to understand what happened over the last 72 hours. On Saturday, President Trump made a statement that sounded like the opposite of peace. He said the United States was, in his words, locked and loaded and ready to strike Iran at what he called levels of military force not seen since World War II. That's about as aggressive a threat as a sitting president can make publicly. Then, within the same statement, he pivoted. He said he had agreed, again in his words, for the future benefit of the world and the survival of a successful and prosperous Iran to cancel the attack. He framed it as a mercy, a choice, something he was doing for Iran's benefit, subject to being able to, quote, rapidly make a deal. Now here's where it gets interesting. Trump didn't just say he called off the strike. He went further. He claimed there was already an agreement in place regarding the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical shipping choke points on the planet, and that a second agreement, this one on denuclearization, was expected to follow. That's a big claim. A deal on the Strait of Hormuz and a nuclear agreement, both apparently locked in, within the same 48-hour window that he was threatening the most powerful strike since World War II. And then today, Monday, Trump said formal talks between the U.S. and Iran were set to begin. So on the surface, this looks like a rapid, dramatic swing from maximum threat to maximum diplomacy in under 3 days. But that's not what Iran is saying happened. Here's where the story splits. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson came out today and directly addressed Trump's claim. And the language was not soft. He said there are no plans to receive a U.S. delegation, no plans to send an Iranian one either. In other words, as of right now, there is no meeting on the books, no delegation is packing a bag, no talks are beginning today in any concrete sense. That is a direct contradiction of the President of the United States, on the record, the same day he made the claim. Now, it's not that there's zero contact between the two countries right now. There is something happening, just not what Trump described. Iran confirmed it's in discussions with Oman about establishing a new shipping route through the Strait of Hormuz. But notice the details here because they matter. This isn't a U.S.-Iran negotiation. It's Iran and Oman, a third-party mediator, discussing a limited temporary corridor for vessels, not a broad agreement on the strait's status. And Iran was explicit that these Oman talks have, quote, no bearing on whether the strait is open or closed more broadly. So when Trump says there's a deal on the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran says we're discussing a narrow shipping lane with Oman, and that's not a decision about the strait as a whole. Those are two very different claims being described as if they're the same thing. And on the nuclear side, the denuclearization agreement Trump said would follow, there's no confirmation from Iran of any nuclear negotiation at all, in progress or scheduled. So to summarize where we actually stand, Trump says talks start today. Iran says no delegation is coming or going. Trump says there's a Hormuz deal. Iran says it's a narrow shipping discussion with a third country that doesn't decide the strait's status. Trump says a nuclear deal is next. Iran hasn't confirmed any such talks exist. That's not a minor miscommunication. That's two governments describing fundamentally different realities on the same day about the same conflict. So let's ask the obvious question. Why would Iran publicly contradict the President of the United States on something this significant? There are a few possibilities worth walking through, and I want to be upfront that we don't have confirmation on which one is correct. But here's what the facts on the ground suggest. Possibility 1. Iran doesn't want to look like it's negotiating from weakness. Iran's military leadership has been using extremely aggressive language recently, accusing the U.S. of, in their words, moving at an accelerating pace to fan the flames of a full-scale regional war. That's not the language of a government quietly walking into talks. If Iran's own domestic audience, a population already dealing with a brutal internal crackdown on protesters, saw their government rushing to the table right after Trump threatened the most powerful strike since World War II, that could look like capitulation. Denying the talks publicly may be as much about controlling the narrative at home as it is about foreign policy. Possibility 2. Trump is getting ahead of the actual diplomacy. It's not unheard of for a U.S. administration to announce progress before the other side has formally signed on, especially when there's pressure to show momentum. If that's what's happening here, Trump's statement may reflect where he wants things to be, or where his negotiators believe things are heading, rather than where they actually are today. Possibility 3, and this is the one worth sitting with. This is deliberate ambiguity on both sides. Trump gets to claim a diplomatic win and de-escalation to a domestic and international audience exhausted by this war. Iran gets to publicly maintain its position of strength and defiance for its own population and regional allies. Both statements can be technically true from each side's framing, while describing something that in practice doesn't yet exist as a finalized deal. Whatever the real explanation is, one thing is clear. The two loudest voices in this conflict are not telling the same story today. And when that happens in a war zone, you should always be cautious before believing either version at face value. Here's what makes this contradiction even more serious. This isn't happening in a vacuum. While Trump and Iran are disputing whether talks are even real, the war itself hasn't stopped. Just this weekend, Kuwait shot down Iranian drones that were targeting critical infrastructure inside its borders. Think about what that means. This is no longer a two-party conflict contained to the U.S., Israel, and Iran. A third Gulf state is now actively intercepting weapons in its own airspace. That's escalation, not de-escalation, happening at the exact same moment Trump is describing a diplomatic breakthrough. And it's not just military escalation. This war has a human cost that's continued through all of this. Iran's judiciary has continued executing people connected to the anti-government protests that have swept the country since the crackdown began. Human rights monitors have reported executions of individuals as young as 19, tried on charges connected to the unrest. This is happening inside Iran, in parallel with the international conflict, and it's part of the full picture of what talks would actually need to resolve, not just missiles and nuclear sites, but a government dealing with serious internal unrest. And then there's the economic layer. Global oil and gas prices have been climbing again as the fighting continues. That's not an abstract statistic. That's every driver, every business, every supply chain feeling the cost of a war that's approaching 6 months old, with no confirmed end in sight. So when you put it all together, drone interceptions in a third country, continued executions inside Iran, rising oil prices worldwide, the idea that this is a moment of calm, stable diplomacy doesn't match what's actually happening on the ground. The war is still live. The talks, if they're real at all, are happening in the middle of continued fighting, not after it. So where does this leave us? I don't think the honest answer here is, peace is breaking out, or this is definitely a trap. I think the honest answer is, we don't know yet, and anyone telling you they know for certain is guessing. But here's what will actually tell us the truth in the coming days, and what I'll be tracking for you on this channel. First, watch for an actual delegation. Not a statement, not a claim. A named group of officials, on a plane, headed to a specific location for a specific meeting. That's the difference between talks being announced and talks actually happening. Second, watch the Strait of Hormuz. If Trump's claimed deal is real, we should see it reflected in shipping activity and insurance rates for vessels moving through that corridor. If nothing changes there, that tells you the deal was aspirational, not actual. Third, watch Iran's military rhetoric. Governments preparing to sit down at a negotiating table typically dial back the flames of war language, even if only slightly. If that rhetoric stays just as aggressive in the coming days, that's a strong signal the diplomatic track isn't as far along as Trump suggested. And fourth, watch the regional spillover. If Kuwait intercepting drones was a one-off, that's one thing. If we see more incidents like it involving other Gulf states, that tells you this conflict is widening, not narrowing, regardless of what's being said about talks in Washington. Here's where I'll leave it. Today, the President of the United States said peace talks with Iran begin. Today, Iran's own government said no such delegation is coming or going. Both of those statements were made on the same day, about the same subject, and they cannot both be fully true. That gap, between what's being announced and what's being confirmed, is exactly where this story lives right now. And it's exactly why I don't think anyone should be celebrating a breakthrough just yet. And I also don't think anyone should assume this is purely theater. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and it's going to take real developments, a delegation, a shipping change, a shift in tone, before we know which version was accurate. I'll be back on the Daniel Brief the moment there's real movement on this, whether that's confirmation of an actual meeting or further escalation that makes today's talk of talks look like it never had a chance to begin with. If this breakdown helped you make sense of a very confusing news day, hit subscribe, drop a comment with what you think is really going on here, and I'll see you in the next one.